Hey everyone, I'm going to begin this short discussion section by asking you to think about someone who you know, maybe a girlfriend or boyfriend, a member of a family, a loved one, someone you know who has gotten themselves into some trouble. Maybe they've gotten into trouble with the law or had some issues with addiction or a bad relationship. Someone's telling you their story or they're telling you their story and it's moving to you. You feel pity and sympathy for them. And that's a real human thing to feel. It's probably good that you do feel that way. It means you're not a sociopath. That doesn't necessarily mean that you want other people to follow that example or that you would wish it on somebody else. But sympathy and reason can exist in the same situation. One doesn't necessarily cancel out the other. I say this by way of prefacing our discussion of Francesca da Rimini today in Canto 5. So as you know, this is a short discussion section that will allow us to focus on some of the most important points of Cantos 5 and 6 and prompt some questions for you to dig a little further into as you return and do more reading. I want to focus on, let's say, 2.5 points of interest today to keep things fresh. The first point is Francesca's moving narrative and the way that it compels us and compels the pilgrim. The half point, because we'll move past it fairly quickly, are the two infernal guardians whom we meet here in the second and third circles of the Inferno. And the third is the prophecy told by the sinner named Ciacco in Canto 6. So the first thing we should mention is that we have encountered here in the second and third circles of the Inferno two more guardians from classical antiquity, Minos and Cerberus. Minos, an ancient king, Cerberus, a mythical three-headed dog, both entirely out of the realm of Christian narrative and mythology, and yet Dante, as usual, draws them into his circumference and puts them to work. What's most remarkable for me is the same thing that we remarked when Virgil encountered Charon earlier, and that is the ease with which he dismisses them. Minos is cranky. He's been assigning sinners to their circles in the infernal pit ever since the fall of Lucifer, and he doesn't want to let Dante pass. Virgil dismisses him with the same authority, the God card that we discussed last time. Cerberus in the next canto seems like a beast whom we ought to fear, but Virgil throws him some mud and the beast laps it up and goes silent. So the remarkable thing once again is that these characters have power and exert it over the sinners in hell, but Virgil and Dante pass easily and unharmed. This will not always be the case, especially later when we come up against some sneaky devils and demons. It will be a greater struggle for Virgil, and that's part of the narrative arc. So Dante establishes a certain pattern here whereby we can depend upon the easy passage of the pilgrim with the authority of Virgil, so that later, when it's interrupted, we grow worried and anxious with the pilgrim. In Canto 5, we have reached the second circle of the Inferno, this one devoted to the lustful. The contrapasso in this circle is a never-ending whirlwind, which whips the souls, the shades of these sinners around in death, just as passion whipped them around in life. So you can perhaps begin to see some of the reason why we read the Vita Nuova last time, and we discussed the ways in which the protagonist of that book was whipped around by his passions before finally learning to find a way to settle himself and center himself on modes of thinking and praising and loving that are not entirely out of control. Remember, these are the circles that are dedicated to so-called sins of incontinence, that is, sins involving a loss of control. Despite the thundering windstorm that Dante portrays for these sinners, he does create a kind of special place for the conversation that is to unfold. That is, the wind stills, and two souls whom Dante the Pilgrim identifies, he calls out to them and they come to him in a moment of seeming respite. As Dante learns, these are the souls of Francesca da Rimini and her lover Paolo. Francesca da Rimini, we know, historically, was a young woman who was married to Gianciotto Malatesta. Gianciotto Malatesta, the brother of Paolo Malatesta. Some of what we know about her biography is accurate and historical. Some has been provided by people like Boccaccio, who elaborate on it creatively and fictively. What we can say here is that she was certainly an historical person, that she was in all likelihood a political pawn who submitted to an arranged marriage in order to settle some political problem. According to the most sympathetic and moving of the narratives, Francesca believed that she was marrying the sweet, young, handsome Paolo, and on the night of her marriage, as she was brought to the city, instead ended up in the arms of his ugly, deformed brother Gianciotto, who, discovering the adulterous relationship that Francesca and Paolo pursued afterwards, in a moment of anger, killed them both. Dante's encounter with Francesca takes place really in two parts. The first is Francesca's explanation, a very paraphrastic or shortened one, of what has happened to her, and it takes the form of a love lyric. And that lyric draws on ideas about love that were familiar to Dante and his contemporaries, and that you should be familiar with now, having read the Vita Nuova. The second part is a narrative. It's a story that's based on, again, the courtly tradition as you're now familiar with it. That is, these are tales of knights and adultery, this one in particular, the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere. Lancelot was King Arthur's greatest knight. Guinevere was Arthur's wife, and the two of them pursued an adulterous relationship that in fact brought about the ruin of the Round Table. The encounter with Francesca begins with a courtesy and a politeness, a chivalric decorum that will be altogether missing from some of the sinners whom we will encounter later. "O living being," she says at line 88, "gracious and benign." Her call to him is in essence a prayer of courtesy, and she suggests that they would indeed pray for him if the king of the universe, that is, if God, whom sinners are not allowed to mention, were their friend. The famous lines begin at 100. "Love that can quickly seize the gentle heart took hold of him because of that fair body taken from me. Love that releases no one loved from loving took hold of me. Love led the two of us unto one death." That's a shortened version of that beautiful love lyric, but it is a synopsis of the story. Love attracted him to me. Love attracted me to him. Love led us to one death. What's important to notice here, and what's important to investigate further, is the fact that Francesca's explanation does not account for actions that she or Paolo took. It places all of the agency or power entirely within the bounds of love, the personified love, as if it were indeed a force, a power, a person, compelling them to do the things they do. The language she uses, the way that she tells her story, eliminates her sense of agency and control. In a way, it exculpates her from the responsibility for having made decisions that have led to this point. At the same time, it draws upon very compelling ideas about love, the God of love, the power of love that were contemporary to Dante, and that Dante even subscribed to in some of his early poems. So this is a moment when Dante has to confront some of his own earlier ideas and perhaps revise them or modify them by considering them in the mouth of this lovely, enchanting, but ultimately suffering woman. After this initial confrontation, Dante is desirous to hear more of her compelling story, and the way she tells it is fascinating because it involves reading, precisely the thing that we are doing now as we encounter her in this text. "One day," she says at line 127, "to pass the time away, we read of Lancelot, how love had overcome him. We were alone and we suspected nothing. And time and again that reading led our eyes to meet and made our faces pale. And yet one point alone defeated us, when we read how the desired smile was kissed by one who was so true a lover, this one, who never shall be parted from me, while all his body trembled, kissed my mouth." A Eliot indeed, that book, and he who wrote it too. That day we read no more. As your notes will tell you, Galeot or Galeotto is the character in the narrative of Lancelot and Guinevere who goes between the two, who facilitates their relationship. He is, in fact, like the book, which facilitates their relationship. There is an irony here in the fact that Francesca, had she continued to read past this initial kiss, would have learned about the fall of the Round Table and the catastrophic events that accompanied this transgression. The great scholarly debate, ongoing still, about Francesca is whether and to what degree Dante wants us to sympathize with her, whether and to what degree we are to regard her and what she says as in some way accurate, and whether or to what degree we are to evaluate her as a sinner trapped in a state of self-deceit and simply as one who, damned among the lustful, could offer no truth. Is Francesca, after all, so much different from the protagonist of the Vita Nuova, who was flung about, whipped around here and there by love? The difference, of course, is the one that she states, which is that she is here with Paolo, from whom she never shall be parted, whereas Dante has indeed been parted from Beatrice because of her death. Something that's important to notice about Canto 5 and Canto 6 as we transition towards it is that Dante says very little about the sin itself. He says very little about carnal relations, about adultery, about lust as something that happens in the loins or in the body. Instead, he psychologizes it. He asks, what is the psychology of one who has lost control, who has given themselves over, who has submitted reason to the rule of desire? Something that's important to notice about Canto 5 and Canto 6 as we transition towards it is that Dante says very little about the sin itself. He says very little about carnal relations, about adultery, about lust as something that happens in the loins or in the body. Instead, he psychologizes it. He asks, what is the psychology of one who has lost control, who has given themselves over, who has submitted reason to the rule of desire? Canto 6, in fact, where we encounter the third circle of the Inferno, the circle of the gluttonous, says almost nothing at all about gluttony, about eating and drinking excessively. Instead, Canto 6 becomes an occasion to portray the city of Florence itself as gluttonous, as having given itself over to envy and greed and stuffed itself full, just as, presumably, the character whom we meet, Ciacco, has stuffed himself full in life. Unlike Francesca, Ciacco's identity is uncertain. We have yet to identify him as an historical personage, and in fact, his anonymity may be deliberate. It may be very well the case that Dante uses someone unknown and unknowable so as to shift the attention from the individual and his story to the city and its story. The gluttonous are assaulted by a never-ending, freezing rain. The contrapasso here is the creation, I think, of a pigsty for them to live in, just as they lived metaphorically in life as pigs. And in fact, the word ciacco in Italian has come to mean pig. Ciacco's early words to Dante at line 49 shift the topic immediately to Florence. Your city, one so full of envy that its sack has always spilled. That city held me in the sunlit life. The name you citizens gave me was Ciacco, and for the damning sin of gluttony, as you can see, I languish in the rain. Dante is moved by Ciacco's story as he was moved by Francesca's. Perhaps not quite so moved, but moved nonetheless. Tell me the reason, Dante asks, why that divided city has been assailed by so much schism. And it's important here to remember that Dante the poet is writing this tale after he has been exiled from the city of Florence. The pilgrim is undergoing the journey in the year 1300, still 2 years before his exile. Ciacco answers him at line 64. After long controversy, they'll come to blood. The party of the woods will chase the other out with much offense. But then within 3 suns, they too must fall, at which the other party will prevail. This party will hold high its head for long, and heap great weights upon its enemies. however much they weep indignantly. This brief and obscure passage is in fact the first of many prophecies that Dante will receive in the Inferno and throughout the Commedia of his impending exile. When Ciacco mentions the party of the woods, he's referring to Dante's party, the party of the white Guelphs. The white and the black Guelphs are warring parties at the time. As perhaps you remember from the introductory video, it has nothing to do with their skin color, rather the flags and banners they wave. And in fact, by this time, the white Guelphs had chased the black Guelphs out of Florence. But as Ciacco prophesies, the black Guelphs will indeed overtake the whites in the year 1302 in the violent coup that results in so much death, chaos, and destruction in the city, and ultimately in Dante's exile. Here then, in the context of a canto about gluttony, about loss of control, about avarice and greed and envy, is the first discussion of the politics that Dante regarded as the ruination of his city, of his people, of culture, and of his own life. It's much easier, of course, to identify with and feel sympathy for Francesca, very much like that person whom I asked you at the beginning of this discussion to think about and recall to your mind. It's important that we understand how to sympathize with and simultaneously reason about a situation like this. But it strikes me as particularly moving that Ciacco, who's not particularly sympathetic, is entrusted with the news of the most sympathetic, perhaps, of all plights in the Commedia. That is Dante's and his exile.